Today's episode is one about courage. The courage to show up as the leader you want to be. Courage to say the things that need to be said. Leaders in high-performing teams, leaders with impact, have that courage, even if it is uncomfortable, messy, and doesn't always go to plan. I'm Lee Griffith, a communications strategist, executive coach and all-round champion of leaders who shun the old-school stereotypes. I'm here to help you get clear on your strategy, implement some self-leadership and connect with those you serve through your communications so that you can deliver improved organisational performance, engagement and reputation. Sign up to my newsletters to receive even more useful insights into how to be an impactful leader. You can also find out how I can support your organisation to better connect with the people it serves. Visit sundayskies.com to find out more. In today's episode, I'm delighted to speak with Sharon Amesu, an expert in building courage in the workplace. We talk about how organisations can change culture, tackle bias, build inclusive and diverse boards, and the inner work leaders need to do to embrace and make change happen. It's one that will get you thinking for sure. Enjoy. So Sharon, thank you so much for joining us on the Leaders with Impact podcast. We're delighted to have you here today. You're a workplace courage consultant. Tell me what that entails.
So what I understand from years of working with organizations and thinking about the various thought leaders, both past and present, who reflected on what it takes for us to be able to get the best out of our people in our organizations, for people to be able to articulate their views, for them to be innovative, for them to be high performing, be the best that they can be and do the best that they can, is that it requires them to be able to raise their hands above the parapet and almost at times risk getting things wrong. And the only way that we're able to do that individually and collectively is when we're willing to be courageous, when we're willing to step outside of those zones of comfort and take the risks and say, even if I'm wrong, I'll still try. It's those who will have the attitude, the mindset to go again and not allow fear of rejection, fear of ridicule to determine whether or not they'll take the chance. And what underpins all of that, therefore, is courage. It's Maya Angelou who said that people forget what you say, they'll forget what you do, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And she also said that courage is the greatest of all of the virtues, that you can't practice any of the other virtues, whatever they might be. You're not able to practice any of them if you don't have courage, the willing to take the risk. And in a time where what we need now more than ever is great innovation. We need people who are willing to wrestle with the knotty, challenging issues that every organization is facing. We have to face into what's often described as VUCA, which is volatility and uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. When we don't have the stable ground that we used to be able to stand on, the predictability of the business landscape, of the workplace futures and all of those things that helped us just to be able to perhaps walk with greater confidence, we have to find something, a resolution within us that enables us to step into the unknown. And for me, it's courage. And that's courage in relation to conversations that we have. Are we willing to lean into those areas that can be taxing and polarizing? Are we willing to bring challenge where we see things are not quite going right, that there's a direction of travel that's not conducive to our growth? Are we willing to face opposition and where there may be dissent to our view, still hold our own? So workplace courage is all about that. How do we create cultures within our organization that are underpinned by courage, where people are able to thrive, prosper, engage, and really advance personally and professionally?
There's so much there that I want to unpack. How did you get to the point that you're at where that's your focus? Because you've had quite an interesting career.
It came largely from personal experience, as is often the case with these things, Lee. So, as you've mentioned, my career started in law. But before that, what drew me into law in the first place was I grew up during the 1970s and 1980s. And during that time in the UK, there was a lot of civil unrest. A lot of communities, in particular the Black community, were facing marginalization, exclusion. They were facing significant disadvantage, discrimination. And what I witnessed, which has never left me, was the resolve among those who were leaders without titles in the communities rising up and bringing together their collective voice in the face of opposition, of obstruction and obstacles, to speak truth to power, irrespective of consequence, because
Mm.
they had something grounded deep within them as to what was right and what was fair and what was just. And I grew up under that. In particular, my dad was a community activist, a social convener, and he was a prominent figure in my life. And observing him and seeing him speak to those who were leading in the education system and bring challenge to the way that, in particular, Black boys were being treated in the education system back in the 1970s and 80s. And in fact, in reality, it still
Mm.
persists today. But I saw courage. I saw individuals like him, and there were others alongside him who had this sense of assuredness about them, that even though there were Goliath that they were facing, they had a sense of knowing who they are, that they were willing to do what needed to be done, even if there was a cost to them. It was this ability to step over the inevitable fear, whatever that might have been, reputationally, financially, whatever it might have been. They were willing to step over that to do the right thing and do what needed to be done. It was that awareness, that early awareness, that really brought me into the legal sector, where, of course, courage is needed in practice extensively, because you'll be facing opponents who might
Mm.
be more senior to you. Certainly, my experience was as a Black woman in the profession, being a minority on at least two fronts in terms of gender and race. And so having the ability to tackle stuff like imposter syndrome and the fear of using your voice in a way as an advocate, which may attract some ridicule in the courtroom or in the robing room or whatever it might be, to be able to stand and hold your own, I had to draw on something. And what I often found myself drawing on in order to ground myself in courage were those stories that I've just relayed to you, looking back at those, for me, matriarchs and patriarchs who were able to stand and hold their own. And courage, therefore, I began through my own evolution. But then, as I began to work with organizations and coach leaders who would often be leaders without authority, Lee, so they'd
Mm.
have a title, but no one would be listening to them because
Mm.
they lacked a sense of credibility and gravitas, because they lacked courage oftentimes. They weren't willing to hold the courageous conversations. They weren't willing to manage performance, perhaps, or where a member of staff was underperforming and it was having an impact on other people on the team, the manager or leader was not willing to have the necessary conversation because they feared the import and the impact of that. So I just began to notice and see these threads emerge and ask myself the question: what does underpin high performance cultures or people being
Mm.
able to thrive? What does make for a good leader? What are the characteristics? What are the traits? And all roads led to courage. It's as
Mm.
though when we look at integrity, so if we were to ask for a list of characteristics of any good leader, we would point to, no doubt, despite sometimes what we see in modern society of leadership, would still point to fundamentally things like honesty, right? We'd point to integrity.
Mm.
We'd point to accountability. All of these, whatever characteristic or trait we would describe, we would then go on by extension to ask ourselves, then how do we do that? How do they manifest that? And at the heart of that, each and every one of those will be courage. As Maya Angelou says, it takes courage to be honest, because it may well be that you'll expose yourself to a weakness or vulnerability. It takes courage to have integrity, because it may well be that you're wrestling with two opposing views. And in fact, behind the scenes, as it were, no one may know the truth of something, but it takes courage to do the right thing. It takes courage to be transparent and really be willing to hold your hands open and say, here's the reality of what's going on, because always there is the risk of, well, is this going to be damaging of my reputation? Is this going to impact us financially? Is this going to impact my future career, etc.? Those will all be considerations that every single leader will have, and no doubt have on a daily basis. But what I see, I've witnessed it personally, professionally, and I see it now through my work. It's the leaders who are willing to be, and I call it competent courage. It's something I've really gleaned from a brilliant author who wrote a book called Choosing Courage. And essentially says courage is not just this sense of speaking at will what comes to mind without any filter, and just doing whatever I want without any consideration of how it impacts other people. Far from it. Courage is considered. True courage is considered. It is about measuring, evaluating, reflecting on the risk, and then having regard to that, then taking action. Now, of course, that's a contrast to those immediate acts of heroic courage, right? Where you've got someone who will see a child in the street and a car's about to go toward them, and then they quickly run over and they lift them off and save the day. All right, so there's not much analysis going on there, if any. It's instinctive. But the reality is, Lee, that 98.8% of the acts of courage that take place are not those heroic acts. It's the everyday acts of being true to yourself, of speaking truth to power, of being truly authentic in how you show up at work. Those are daily acts. And those acts of considered, competent courage are the ones that require us to have pause, reflect, and really think about, are we going to step over that line of fear and do what needs to be done and make the decision that needs to be made?
Yeah. There's so much synergy with the leaders I work with, because similarly, we're looking at how do they bring their full selves into an organisation and perhaps fight against those stereotypes and the old school way of leadership that still prevail in a lot of organisations and still prevail. Particularly, I work with public sector, and we hear all sorts coming out of some of those organisations, and we look at how they can communicate and connect and take people with them. But it means for them to do that, they've got to build and earn trust, which comes from that point that you're saying, the courage to do things differently and to do things that feel correct and authentic to them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the daily challenge, isn't it? Of any leader who is worth their salt, who is leading essentially, they will face daily challenges that they are confronted with, which draws on their ability to stand and do the right thing. And those roads, that the opportunities for us to do the wrong thing avails itself to everyone throughout the day. And it takes courage to do the right thing.
Yeah, completely. So today we're absolutely going to explore all of this in more detail, and also maybe help get some practical things that people who are listening can take forward. And I want to explore a bit around the topic of diversity in senior leadership as well, and this thought around tackling bias and discrimination in the workplace, because I know that's something that you're really passionate about as well. And I suppose I want to start from the point of acknowledging that it can be a really difficult subject for people to raise and to talk about. They might feel uncomfortable or scared about saying or doing the wrong thing, and that backlash that comes when they do. And it doesn't necessarily need to be just about diversity issues. The thing you're talking about, courage, it could be anything that they're trying to challenge the status quo, is that fear of backlash and saying and doing the wrong thing. And I suppose I come from a point of, we need to have messy conversations, and I completely acknowledge, probably in the space of this conversation that you and I are having, that I'm going to not word things very well or be a bit clumsy in my approach, but I'm kind of happy to, be put back in and corrected, or, at least I'm having that conversation. And I think with that courage breeds comfortableness in people to feel that they can say something without fear of what might happen as a result. So what's your advice, I suppose, to leaders who perhaps are avoiding the difficult topics, whatever they might be?
I always begin with the basic understanding of human behavior. And sometimes in these conversations, Lee, we lose sight of the fact that there is a fundamental humanity in me and there's one in you. And that then helps us to appreciate what are the types of things that helps us to build good relationships with anyone else in our life. Well, one, there is a sense of patience, there is interest, genuine interest, there's genuine care, and we are able individually to discern when someone's genuinely interested in us, when they genuinely care. We have an appreciation and an awareness of where there is good intention toward us. Why does that matter? Because where those are in existence, that the sense that someone cares for me, that they have good intentions toward me, that between us we have, that they listen and that there is empathy between us, then when that person gets things wrong, which inevitably they will, because back to that humanity point, there are none among us who are perfect. There
Mm.
is a certain level of grace and there is a certain level of leeway that just exists in the relationship that enables us to be able to accommodate each other's foibles and failings. When I look at my own personal relationships, my husband, my children, we say things to each other not intentionally, but sometimes there may be a comment which may be slightly off. There is a relationship between us, which means that they're able to come back to me and say, I didn't actually like that statement, or I
Mm.
didn't like that comment, or vice versa. I know you didn't intend that, but here's how it impacted me. What it means is because there is this safety that we have created between us, I have greater confidence that I'm able to speak and know that if I'm saying something that might cause offense, there is sufficient mileage between us, relationship capital between us, that I can trust that they'll come and speak to me and they'll raise that issue, and vice versa. And for the large part, that's not articulated. There's no long conversation. What is the relationship capital between us, etc. But we essentially know through the time that we built relationship, we spent time with each other, we have conversations, we get to know each other's triggers, etc. We have built our communication to the point where there is safety for candor and vulnerability and
Mm.
honesty. We've created the conditions for that. So, my first point that I would say to leaders is build good relationships around you with people that you need to have honest conversations with. So often there is this sense that we can just, that the sense of impairment and fear is most definitely understood, Lee. I get that, in particular in a time of cancel culture. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think sometimes the volatility in our public sphere can be so divisive. It means that people fall into paralysis and don't say anything. If in doubt, I would say it's best not to, oftentimes, especially where, in particular in social media, as opposed to general relationships,
Mm.
because social media is just not the platform to be outing views that you are either not clear will be polarizing or have the potential to be polarizing.
Mm.
And I always advise leaders to be careful about how they articulate their courage in those sorts of platforms. But coming into the workplace, building relationships with your colleagues, those colleagues who are different, diverse to you in whatever form, whether it be the protected characteristics of the Equalities Act in the UK, or the plethora of other forms of diversity, finding out about different people's experiences, understanding their world, taking the time to be genuinely, humbly curious, having good intentions in that, all of those create the conditions for people to be able to explore and have candid, honest, courageous conversations.
Mm,
Because when it comes to the issue, for example, of bias, as you just referenced, that is something that exists in all of us. It's a part of
mm,
both the human condition and cognition. So it's who we are, and it's by necessity. All right. There's lots of research which points to the fact that having bias helps us to be able to make decisions more quickly. So we're not having to process the millions of pieces of data that we're receiving constantly. It helps us to have those shortcuts to decision making. So they're necessary. What becomes problematic is when those quick, unconsidered, subconscious decisions, as it were, start to be detrimental to other groups, whatever those groups
mm.
might be. And that's where we need to really question that. But we have to engage in conversations around this, because if we don't, the situation and problem does not go away. It simply becomes more embedded. And the
Yeah.
paralysis that I often see around this, which is it's too scary to talk about. I don't know if I'm going to get it wrong. I don't know if I'm going to cause offense, leads people to, and therefore I'm not going to talk about it. Meanwhile,
Mm,
this thing is these differences, these contentions, these issues, the data around discrimination and harassment and so on, they still sit. They're not being dealt with. And also frustration begins to emerge for those disenfranchised and marginalized groups whose issues are not being addressed. So it doesn't go away.
yeah.
And therefore, the question is, how do we deal with it? Not should we deal with it? And it starts with having really good relationships, building strong relationships, communicating. You'd appreciate that, Lee. Communicating good intention, being
Mm,
consistent in that. And then over time, that builds trust, and you're able to have that open dialogue.
yeah. You touched on the thing around everyone having bias, and I interviewed Sharon Carter, who's the chief exec of Hexagon Housing, for a previous episode of the podcast, and we had this same conversation around everyone has some form of bias, and actually the key is you bringing that awareness to yourself around how that's influencing your behaviours and your decision making. And I know that's something that you work with organisations on a day-to-day basis. So how do leaders become more attuned, I suppose, to those biases that might be at play?
There's a really interesting book that I came across recently, and the title is called Slow Looking. The author's name escapes me, but it's called Slow Looking. And the author invites us to treat our lives and our relationships and our world like like we're in an exhibition.
Right.
And we walk through, and when we're going to an exhibition or a museum or whatever it might be, we pay close attention, we observe, we start to notice, because we've slowed down our pace and we've taken the time to pay attention. We start to zoom into things that we would otherwise miss. So if you can imagine the contrast between going to an art exhibition and alternatively simply rushing through to catch a tube train, or catch a train and you're just rushing, there are images at the train station, but you're getting your train, you're not really
Mm,
paying attention to anything but heading with a beeline right to your train. There's a difference. You're taking the time, you're taking pause. I would say that the same applies really to how we become aware of our biases. We start to pay attention. We start to notice how we made decisions and ask ourselves questions about how we've made those decisions, such as, would I have made the decision like this if the person had different characteristics? So, for
mm,
example, if I'm making a decision about a male colleague, would I have made the decision if it was a female colleague? Same decision. Or if it's a young person, would I have made the same decision if it was an older person? Or if it's a white colleague, would I have made the same decision if it was a colleague of a different ethnicity or race? Yes? So start asking ourselves those questions. Another really useful approach to this is to surround ourselves with other views, other diverse
Mm,
perspectives. Because so often what we can do is we make decisions on our own in isolation. We are almost like a confirmation bias. We're clear
mm,
that we are right because all of the evidence in our heads points to the fact that we are. So we tend to believe ourselves, and when we've made a decision, we believe it's right. And that's why I for example, value, and this is why I suspect we have, when we're recruiting, we'll have a panel. Why? Because simply having the perspective of one person making a decision about who should be recruited in an organization, where, for example, it's a larger organization, then there is a sense of bringing a range of perspectives around the table that we can discuss and we can mull and we can reason together to see, well, are we seeing the same thing?
mm,
Are there certain traits that I've missed that you have seen, etc. So there is a, sort of a proverb which says that there is wisdom in the counsel of many. And so sense checking, gauging with others. Here is what I'm thinking of doing. What do you think of that? And not as well simply having that group being made of people who are like you, because
yeah.
otherwise, to some degree, whilst there's always many forms of diversity, the danger is, Lee, that you're simply working with and asking the opinion of people who think like you, who have a shared background. And that diversity of perspective in reaching your decisions is clearly impaired. So having people who do have different viewpoints to your own, different worldviews even to your own,
Mm,
and probing with them. And then on a more practical level, I believe that we as leaders, there's two more things. One is I believe in the power of journaling. It links to the first point I was making, and that through the power of journaling, you're able to pay attention to patterns. So, what are you seeing about choices that you've made,
mm,
about behaviors? What are you noticing through feedback? Yes. So I believe that good leaders elicit feedback and do so routinely. They ask people, how are you experiencing my leadership, my decision making, the approaches that I'm taking? They create an open, confidential forum for there to be that sharing in. And
mm,
then journaling, I believe taking the time to really reflect on what am I hearing, what patterns am I seeing, and taking the time to respond to that. And then finally, a really practical thing is there's something called the MIT test. The
mm,
MIT test is something that's been used millions of times. And what it does is it's Americanized. So it's important for listeners to be aware that there is that lens to it. It's not necessarily an impairment in and of itself. It's that there will be aspects of it that won't be relevant, for example, to audiences in the UK or audiences in Europe. That's really something to be aware of. But there is great utility around it because what it essentially does is it gets us to start thinking, Lee, about the narratives and the stories that we have been exposed to that influence us. In other words, it acknowledges and it helps us to acknowledge that we are all socialized. There are
mm,
none of us who are void of the impact of our environment, of our upbringing. We are all shaped by the views that we've been exposed to when we were growing up. We've all been
mm,
shaped. We all continue to be shaped by the media that we consume, by the imagery, by the news that surround us. We're all influenced and shaped by that. And so what those tests invite us to do is ask ourselves the question. So if this image flashes up, what's our immediate instinctive response to that? What's the word that we use if we see a young black person who is wearing certain attire? Do we assume that they are involved in some type of illegal activity? What comes up for us? And then through the process of the test, you're able to see where perhaps your biases sit. Now, it can be
Mm,
for many confronting and challenging. But what it does is, I believe it's important to see it without judgment. Just observe it, slow looking. Just observe what's emerged from it, and ask ourselves the question: what is it telling me, and how have we got here? Now, part of that story narrative might be, what did we hear about race when we were growing up? What did we
mm,
hear about people from other countries? What did we hear about migrants? And when we look at that and we think about, well, is that narrative something that's influencing now how I perceive certain people from different demographics? And by extension, if if it's sitting there somewhere beneath the surface, how do I become mindful so that I don't allow it to impair how I engage with those people? Because so often, most of us, I believe, Lee, believe ourselves to be good people. There is
mm,
no one who would consciously say, yes, I am racist and I am proud. I am sexist and I am proud. I am ageist and I am proud. There are 0.00% of the population would consciously, willfully, and deliberately say, I behave in a discriminatory way toward a certain group of people, and I do so unapologetically. Most people believe themselves to be good people. All right. So if we have that as a fundamental premise, as the hypothesis, and then we weigh that up against, well, what are the results in wider society? I'm talking about in the West principally.
mm,
But if we weigh that up against the results and outcomes for various demographics, so if we look at the outcomes for women in the workplace and the gender pay gap, for example, well, would the majority of men say, yes, I think we should pay women less than men? No, there would never be that conscious decision, and that's having regard to all of this sort of historic structural issues. But ultimately, we are at a point in our history where women, for the most part, are still underpaid compared with their male counterparts. It was just recently I was having a conversation with my daughter about those disparities within the legal sector, and they are significant. They are
mm,
stark. And over time, cumulatively, they build to a picture of huge disadvantage that impacts your retirement, it impacts your pension, etc. You can your daily living.
mm.
Yes. So, having a conscious decision intention rather, that we will check our biases, because all of us fall victim to them in some form or other, and being intentional by having this slow looking, observing, looking at our patterns, doing journaling, some reflection, asking for feedback from those around us as to how they're experiencing our behaviors, and also surrounding ourselves with people who will think differently to us to help us really reflect on our decision making. All of those things, I believe, help to mitigate the risk of negative bias in our decision making.
Yeah. Thank you. And I suppose linked to that, I know you do a lot of work with boards around building an inclusive board. And I suppose I'm interested in, what does that look and feel like to someone who is external to that board, and what would they be noticing for a board who is truly embracing inclusivity?
A good board always has a good chair. It starts there. It starts with any board that I've sat on that has been a good board has always had a good chair. A
Mm,
chair who has been mindful that diversity and inclusion is important, that they're intentional about, one, eliciting people's views, and also creating the space for those views to be heard. And they recognize that they are not the person who has all of the answers, nor has to have all of the answers. They lean on the knowledge in the group to progress the organization. If you look at any data point right now, Lee, you'll see that representation at board level is very poor in terms of
mm,
diversity. It is very poor. In fact, that stubborn data remains quite stark and shocking. So, in terms of diversity and board representation, that is not there. What I'm speaking then to more broadly is acknowledgement on those boards of that gap and
Mm,
the intention to close it. And in the meantime, as they journey toward that, are intentional about creating safe spaces where board members are able to share their viewpoints, have open dialogue. You'll see evidence of active listening, taking the time to genuinely listen. And there is an intention for those boards to develop themselves. They understand the skills that they have and they are intentional about filling the gaps. That for me is the evidence of seeing really good boards work well, having regard to the caveat that there could always be better where there is greater diversity of
mm.
experience and thought.
How do organisations shift from, I suppose, those tokenistic gestures that we often see, and they might say the right things, but actually, how do they shift that to taking the right types of actions? Because you've referenced yourself the fact that, you know, change is taking a long time and it isn't really changing. And you've seen reports in lots of different industries where they've, 20, 30 years things were recommended and they're still not really being executed. There was the report from the Macpherson report, wasn't it, however many years on from that being one example. And we get these flurries of activity where people feel they should be saying something and then it all just goes quiet. So how did organisations do that shift?
I believe that it's three parts to it. I describe it as commitment, compassion, and accountability.
Mm,
So if you can imagine, first of all, commitment being on a vertical axis and compassion being on a horizontal axis, where you have low levels of commitment and low levels of compassion, you have apathy and indifference.
mm,
Where you have high levels of compassion but low levels of commitment, you've got tokenism. What does that look like? Oh, those poor people, they're treated so unfairly. That's so discriminatory and so unfair. But when it comes to actually doing something about it, there is nothing. There is no action. There is no follow through. So that's compassion. You're moved. You're saddened by it. You're not doing anything about it. If you go on the high levels of commitment, low levels of compassion, there you have compliance. So I will do what needs to be done because regulation and the law requires me to do so. I don't really care how it impacts people's lives. Here is what the law requires me to do. And, there may be some penalties for me if I don't do it.
mm.
Ultimately, what happens there, Lee, is that where those regulations perhaps are no longer in place, then you won't do it because there's no real tug on your heart. There's no sense of moral obligation to do the right thing. It's the legal obligation to do the right thing. But the sweet spot, and to your point around how you ensure that organizations shift from tokenism to meaningful action, is where you have high levels of commitment, you have high levels of compassion, and you have accountability. They sit in that top box
Mm.
because what that says is, I am moved by this issue. I will do the work because it's the right thing to do. And I'll be measuring my results to make sure that we are doing what we'll say we'll do.
Yeah, I'm very visual, so I've already got the the chart in my head as you talk that through. I
Yeah.
think that's really helpful. Yeah, anyone can sit there and go, where do I think where do I sit and where does my organisation sit? So I think that's really helpful. I suppose one of the things that's triggered that thought as you were talking is where the burden of change lies, because I think there's this almost this push and pull of wanting to create safe spaces for those who perhaps feel minoritized or are minoritized, and organizations hand over responsibility to those to make the change happen. And then that becomes, I completely get, really exhausting on them the board think, tick, we've done our duty, we've done the compliance bit and we've handed it over. So how do leaders start to balance that empowering people with and making them feel that they are being heard and listened to and all of that stuff, with the fact that they've got to take the personal responsibility for making change happen?
So the place where it doesn't start is where I start. It doesn't rest solely with HR.
Mm-hmm.
And so often what happens is when it comes to this work in particular of driving this agenda of diversity and inclusion, it's often just allocated to HR.
Yeah.
HR will sort it out and all will be well. And that is one, unfair on HR, is two, unrealistic, and three, it's just setting an organization up for failure. What we are talking about here is culture change.
Mm.
Changing hearts and minds and mindsets. Well, how do we do that? It starts, first of all, with role modeling, doesn't it? That you cannot do this work of setting the tone and culture of an organization without the leaders in the organization role modeling very clearly, transparently, honestly, what it looks like by doing it and being it themselves. And also being honest, candid, and vulnerable when they get things wrong. So, role modeling, communication across the organization is key. And you'd, of course, appreciate this, Lee. What is the direction of travel? And communicating that clearly across the organization, everywhere in the organization, that there be no dark corner that's
Mm.
obscured from this message that this is who we are. And it comes through every form of connection, communication. It comes through in your onboarding. So when you're recruiting people, this is who we are. This is the culture that we're seeking to create. It comes through in your performance reviews. So to what extent have you engaged with this particular type of attribute in your work? It's almost as though, because you're by design wanting to ensure that this becomes embedded, it's across everything. It's
Mm.
unmissable. And you ensure that it's threaded through everything. So role modeling, communication, and something I feel from experience, having witnessed it really take root in other organizations, is this idea of the champion or the ambassador. So having those people in your organization who are specifically tooled and equipped to be the ambassadors, the voice, the champions of the agenda, they're the people who will continue to actively encourage other people to be participants, to engage, to be proactive and appreciate the value of this. Empowering them starts to empower others. So one thing that you can't do is drive. Even leaders, powerful command control leaders, are not able to drive culture change on their own. That
Mm.
needs to be something that is cascaded, and having those voices, what in your senior leadership team, in your senior management team, and then as that goes further down, really having those champions that will highlight the vision and draw people into that as you go deeper into the organization. Communicate those messages that you're seeking to communicate, have the same passion and fervor that you have as a leader. Those things are really impactful in ensuring that this doesn't just become one department's issue, that
Mm.
this is actually something that all of us need to embrace actively.
And do you think that that's the same approach? We briefly touched on the fact that there perhaps isn't great diversity at board level. And when you do get someone who is representative of a minoritized group at board, they possibly have got this dual thing of having to tackle head on bias and discrimination that they're facing because of the situation that they're in, whilst also being that role model for others in and outside the organisation. Is the approach the same for that? Because I suppose I'm conscious of the burden and then being pigeonholed as the poster person for whatever that issue might be, which I suppose belittles their offer as a leader at that most senior level.
Yeah, there is a danger. There is that risk that you become the person, the go-to person. But what we know is sort of the history of a movement. There's a great video that I watched of a movement, and it was an individual who was moving, and somehow others started watching him and they started moving. And there just became this dance in this park of these people just starting this movement, this gathering of dancers in a park. It was quite random. And that's the hallmark of a really good movement. It's the empowering of the many. It starts with the one, it cascades to the next and the next and the next and the next. And when you're creating change, you're clear in the way in which you communicate and you hold the space and you encourage other people to be participants, that you are not the only solution to this by any stretch, that we are all coming in it together, and you start to cascade that knowledge and empower the next to be the beacon and the voice.
So we get into the end of our time together. I want to touch briefly on the non-traditional leadership development, because that's something that I'm interested in. And I don't think that senior leaders are particularly well supported in that transition from when they're being in their specialist role to this organisational generalist, and all the broader skills that they're expected to bring into that most senior role. How do you think leadership development needs to change to reflect maybe the issues that you and I have been talking about today?
Leadership development needs to change by, first of all, acknowledging that it needs to change. So if the expectation is that we can do as we're doing to respond to the future of the world of business, of the workplace, of the world as we are, will become irrelevant. Actually, leaders who recognize that there needs to be an evolution to be relevant are the ones actually who are best placed to respond to that. And then to understand, well, what are people saying that they need from us? Because leadership is largely about how do we get the best out of people so that they can be bought into our vision and to perform. That's really what leadership is about. Well, how do we get the best out of people? It's about understanding from them what gets the best out of them without making assumptions. And we know that we're aware of and we're appreciative of situational leadership. But in the main, what we understand now more than ever is that people want to be consulted. They want to have a voice. They're feeling much more empowered, aren't they? So leadership needs to respond to that. It needs to be much more distributed. It needs to be much more collaborative and inclusive. And the leaders who get that, they understand that we need to change. We do need to evolve. And they're listening to their people as to how best to become the leader that they need to be in the moment that we're in. Those are the ones who'll be most impactful in the future.
Perfect. My final question, and it's a quickie. What's the one piece of advice you'd give every chief exec or senior leader listening to this episode?
I would encourage every leader to be strong and courageous.
Perfect. No more needs to be said. Thank you so much for your time today. I literally could talk all day about this. There's so many other questions, but I'm sure you've got other things you need to be doing. So thank you.
Great speaking with you, Lee.
If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and let me know what you thought on LinkedIn. You can find me at Lee Griffith. I'll be back with the next episode in 2 weeks' time. So in the meantime, sign up to my newsletter at sundayskies.com for monthly insights on how else you can lead with impact. Until next time.